For 3 weeks, we have been looking at Abraham in Hebrews chapter 11 as we look at the list of heroes. Today, we're going to take a look at 3 generations from Abraham as we look to his son Isaac, his grandson Jacob, and his great-grandson Joseph. So what I'd like to do, I think there's one thing that is really important, that there's a reoccurring theme that's happening, is that we read and we understand that multiple times in Hebrews 11, by faith or by means of faith, there was an action, there was a response, as faith was being carried along, as James talks about. And that's because in faith, when we believe in God, right? And after that, we believe God when he speaks. Even though the circumstances might be a little difficult or the consequences may be there, but we believe in God and we believe God when he speaks. So let's take a look as we look to these 3 generations after Abraham in Hebrews chapter 11. We read, by the means of faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Poor Isaac, he only gets one line, just one line. But there's a lot to tell. There's a lot of story there. In the Genesis record, we read of Isaac picking up the faith baton from his father, Abraham. We read, now there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, and the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt, dwell in the land of which I will tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you, for you and your offspring. I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham, your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and I will give to you, or your offspring, all these lands, and in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. So all these covenant promises that were given to Abraham is also being given to Isaac as well. But for Isaac, and as we're going to take a look at for his son Jacob and then for Joseph, they still had to have a personal relationship. They couldn't ride off the coattails of their father or grandfather Abraham. You ever hear the saying, God doesn't have any grandchildren? No grandchildren. He has what? Children. He has children. And so even though there was this great promise, a great amount of faith that was exhibited by Abraham, we see that there had to be a loyalty to God, a faith in God, believing in God and believing when God speaks for Isaac and for Jacob and also for Joseph. A believing loyalty that is, even for us today, required of every one of us as we walk on this earth, as we believe in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Amen? Okay. Now, the thing about Isaac, he was spiritually weak. And I'll tell you, if you read some of Genesis, it's like crazy. There's a lot of treachery going on. Jacob is God's choice. Although he's the younger, he gets the blessing through some treachery instead of Esau. So just a lot of craziness that's going on. But when all was said and done, by means of faith, Isaac passed a blessing to Jacob, who would really be the heir of this promise from God. We talked about this, I think, last week or during one of our classes too. Our faith, our walk as Christians, it can be sloppy sometimes, can't it? Yeah. I mean, again, when you talk about being transparent, we ever hear, well, real Christians, real Christians have difficulties. They have difficult times, and believe me, as we're looking at Isaac and Jacob, maybe not so much Joseph, but at least 2 out of the 3, it was sloppy. But God carried them through. And ultimately, they had this believing loyalty to God that even within these moments of weakness and sin, they believed in God and they believed God when he spoke. So Isaac has this believing loyalty. so that as he is reaching the end days or the end hours of his life, he is looking to the future that is promised by God at the final hours of his life. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying at the very last hours of his life, blessed each of the sons of Joseph. Joseph had two sons, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. And what is phenomenal here is that there is this wish prayer, this blessing that Jacob is giving. And they're so acting on faith, as Isaac was also, because neither one of them could personally give what was promised to Joseph and his sons. Because Isaac and Jacob were both totally dependent on God to fulfill those blessings that would one day be achieved when they reached the promised land. And I'll tell you, Isaac and Jacob, they ended well. They ended well. And those final hours, as they both looked to the future, looked forward, trusting God with their lives at the very end, in those last few hours of their lives. What a testimony. What a witness. In fact, we read in the historical document in Genesis chapter 48, and Jacob, who was then called Israel, stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and normally that wasn't done. The older would normally get that ultimate blessing and the leadership, but because God wanted this, it was laid on Ephraim. And his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. So it was kind of going against the grain, but this is what God wanted. And Jacob or Israel blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from evil, all evil, bless these boys," Joseph's two boys, "and in them let my name be carried on, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." Jacob, later to be known as Israel, blessed Ephraim and Manasseh to take Joseph's place, so to speak, under Abraham and Isaac for the blessing. And again, what I think is so beautiful is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even though they received the promise, they never saw the land. And therefore, when they gave this blessing to Joseph's sons, they could not make it happen, but they totally depended on God so they could look to the future. They can look to the future as it is done. It's a done deal. And so at the very end of their life, the very last hours of their life, they could end well because they believed in God and they believed God when he spoke, no matter what the circumstances, no matter what the outcome in this life. Now, as we look at Joseph specifically today, one of Jacob's sons, I'd like to turn to, let's just get a little running start. Let's back up a bit and go. As we look, by faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau, looking to the future in the last hours of his life. By faith, or by the means of faith, Jacob, when dying, last hours of his life, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. And as we take a look at Joseph, by means of Joseph now, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave direction concerning his bones. Joseph spent all of his adult life in Egypt. He never saw the fulfillment of the promise. Fourth generation. And yet he so believed And it's kind of the short story of it all, because there's so much with Joseph. He lived in the land of Canaan with his father Jacob, or we're going to say Israel, 11 other brothers, a lot of family. Joseph was despised by his brothers. So they threw him in a pit. They sold him as a slave, and wow. Sold him as a slave. He became a slave in Egypt. And then he became number 2 man under Pharaoh. I mean, what in the world? And Joseph was so intent and so believed God that we read in Genesis chapter 50, I mean, the historical part of this now. And Joseph said to his brothers, this was in Egypt, I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones from here, from Egypt. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And what he is doing is he's prophesying on things that will happen hundreds of years later. And he believes it so much so that he says, and when it happens, take my bones out of Egypt and take me to the land that was promised. Wow. I don't know about you, but sometimes it's hard to have enough faith just across the street. Really? Man, I mean, and we're just getting started in Hebrews 11, you know. We're just getting started with a lot of the Christians all over the world, the martyrs who are actually dying for their faith. We'll be looking at that through the next few weeks. And just to get an idea of what happened is Joseph predicted this, and we read that Joseph, because of his number 2 position in Egypt, there was a famine, and his father Jacob, all his family, I think there were 70 altogether, came to Egypt. They were under sort of a favorite status position in Egypt. Things were going really well until Joseph died. And we read then Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king, or we could say Pharaoh, over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, these people, or the people of Israel, are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. And we read a little bit later, therefore they set a taskmaster over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. Let's go back to Hebrews 11:22. By the means of faith, hundreds of years before this, at the end of his life, the last few hours of his life, as Joseph is looking forward in faith, he mentions the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. The nation of Israel was in Egypt for 400 years in slavery and oppression. Then God, through Moses, led the people out in what is called Exodus, right? The Exodus. By means of faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the Exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. So hundreds of years before the actual event, Joseph prophesied. And made the Israelites promise when that time came that they would take his bones out of Egypt. We actually read in Exodus 13:19, when the Exodus began, Moses actually started to fulfill that promise. Hundreds of years later, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him in the Exodus, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. Now, Moses didn't actually make it to the promised land. He died before he actually got there. But the next leader, Joshua, did fulfill that promise. And speaking about Joshua's death, a little further on, after these things, Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him, Joshua, in his own inheritance at Timnath-Serah, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaash. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. As for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem, in the piece of land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. It became an inheritance of the descendants of Joseph. Joseph's wish is granted. Israel starts to become a nation. They start to receive the land as a promise. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. 4 generations. Abraham received the promise, but each one individually had to choose to have a believing loyalty to God. They had to each believe in God and believe God when he spoke. 4 generations. And even when by faith they could not see the fulfillment of that promise because it was way, way, way in the distance. Why? What an example of faith. In Hebrews 11:13 we read, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth." Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph ended well because they had faith in God, looking to the future in their last few hours. They finished well. Hebrews 11 from the Message Bible. By an act of faith, Isaac reached into the future as he blessed Jacob and Esau. By an act of faith, Jacob on his deathbed blessed each of Joseph's sons in turn, blessing them with God's blessing, not his own, as he bowed worshipfully upon his death. By an act of faith, Joseph, while dying, prophesied the exodus of Israel and made arrangements for his own burial.